Hello everyone, Professor Scalar here, hoping you're all having a wonderful day, and welcoming you to a video that I've been meaning to make for quite a while now. Back when Rundown 6 first dropped, a lot of people were talking about the 4 melee weapons and how good or bad they were, and I wanted to make a detailed video on them soon afterwards. But seeing how some of them weren't exactly balanced.
Sorry team, I'm not very good at killing scouts.
I got a kill.
Shit, I don't know if you heard that.
I heard that. That's the joke.
Oh, there's the giant.
I decided to wait a few patches until it seemed like the 4 melee weapons were in a position that the devs were happy with. And then, I'll be completely honest, I sort of forgot about the video idea and got distracted with other videos. But fast forward a bit, and here we are now with said video. So what are we going to be discussing today? Well, the purpose of this video isn't to crown one of the weapons as the god of all melee choices or make any sort of tier list. Rather, I'll be covering each melee individually and going over 2 main topics. The first one being the weapon statistics and tidbits of information that you can't necessarily gather from just the stats alone, and then the second one being how effective the weapon is at dealing with certain types of enemies. More specifically, small enemies like the strikers and shooters, medium enemies being the chargers, large enemies being things like giant strikers, giant shooters, and etc. And then finally we'll be talking about special enemies, which are going to be the scouts. The purpose for all of this is to show that each melee weapon has a place in the game. Each one has their own pros and cons that you should consider when making a decision on which melee you want to bring with you into the level you're about to do. In a way, treat the melee weapons like you would the guns and the tools. All of them are viable and can get the job done, so it just comes down to personal preference and the type of challenges you'll be facing. Some melee weapons are better in certain situations than other ones, so you might want to bring those, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to take them in every level in order to succeed. And of course, you should also take into consideration the melee weapons that the rest of your team are taking. There's a lot to each of the melee weapons that I want to go over today, so let's hop right into it and start off with our first candidate. Up first, we have a classic melee weapon that many of you are probably quite familiar with, and that would be the Sledgehammer. For those of you who don't know, before Rundown 6 there used to be 4 different melee weapons. Specifically, the gavel, the maul, the mallet, and the sledgehammer. And these 4 melee weapons had the exact same stats, it was just a cosmetical difference between them. And the game was basically built around these 4 melee weapons. Now, while the sledgehammer has transitioned over into Rundown 6, it is not the same as it used to be. First of all, it does look a bit different, but more importantly, the stats have been changed. Specifically, the stats have been nerfed a little bit. That way it wouldn't be the undoubtedly supreme ruler of the 4 melee weapons. But even then, the Sledgehammer is still a very solid choice and is a well-rounded melee weapon that you can choose. When it comes to the stats of it, it does 3 damage with a basic attack, 20 damage with a charged attack, it takes about 1.7 seconds to fully charge it up, its stamina consumption is high. We say high because there's not an exact percentage of stamina that it consumes, so we're going to go with rounded values. It has a precision damage multiplier of 1.0 on both basic and charge attacks. It has a 3 times stagger multiplier on basic hits and a 5 times stagger multiplier on charged hits. And then finally, it has a 3 times environmental multiplier on both basic and charged attacks. There's quite a few stats that we just went over there quickly, but for the most part, they're all fairly self-explanatory. And the Sledgehammer is doing pretty good in most of those categories. That's a lot of raw damage, some of the highest in the game. There is a melee weapon that could technically hit harder than the Sledgehammer, but we'll talk more about it later. It has a good stagger multiplier, so you will be staggering enemies fairly often with it. It has good environmental damage multiplier. For those who don't know, environmental damage is things against like padlocks and doors, so you could break those down a lot easier. The only real places that the Sledgehammer lacks is in its charge time, stamina consumption, and precision damage multiplier. That charge time is one of the longest of all the melee weapons. It has the absolute highest stamina consumption of all the melee weapons, and it doesn't do any bonus damage to the head. Granted, it does bonus damage to heads because of enemies with their head damage multiplier, but it doesn't do bonus damage because of the Sledgehammer having its own precision multiplier, so do keep that in mind. But obviously, stats alone don't really mean much So we need to look at how it fares against certain type of enemies to see the practical application. So let's talk about how the Sledgehammer fares against certain type of enemies. When it comes to regular strikers and shooters, the Sledgehammer is fairly effective. Due to its base damage, you are able to one-tap shooters to the back of the head with a simple swing, and you're able to one-tap strikers to the back of the head with a simple swing, and then one more simple swing anywhere on the body. So technically 2 taps. Which just makes it that if you can get behind strikers and shooters, you can kill them really quickly. And even if you can't get behind them, you only need about a 50% charge to the head in order to finish them off, making it so that as long as you know what you're doing and you've done it a bit, you are able to effectively chain kill strikers and shooters with the Sledgehammer. However, you need to be careful if they are in larger groups, because if you wake up 4, 5, 6, or even more strikers and shooters at the same time, you're not going to be able to hold your ground and bonk each one after another without them being able to hit you back. And if you try to run circles around them and charge up your melee and just keep hitting them while dodging their hits, well, due to the high stamina consumption of the Sledgehammer, you will find your pulse maxing out pretty quickly, and you are going to slow down and you're going to get hit a whole lot easier. So while you could deal with smaller enemies in smaller groups, in larger groups they are a little bit more threatening. When it comes to dealing with chargers, it's quite similar. You could deal with them with 1 fully charged hit to the back in the spinal column, or if you can't get behind them, 2 fully charged hits to the front will finish them off. The first one having enough damage behind to stagger the charger, making it a lot easier to get that second one off before it recovers. However, you need to be careful of chargers if there are multiple of them very close to each other. You might be able to deal with 2 chargers at the same time if they're both coming after you, but trying to deal with 3 or even 4 is just out of the question. And because they are faster and their attacks are much quicker, you can't exactly run circles around them and actually get away with that. So be careful of chargers if there are multiple of them really close to each other. When it comes to giant type enemies, as you could probably already guess, the Sledgehammer is fairly effective at dealing with them. As long as you have at least just 2 Sledgehammers on your team, you should be able to stealth kill them from behind fairly effectively with the rest of your team. Or if you find yourself in a situation where you have to go toe-to-toe with a giant that's awake, you are able to deal with it. The Sledgehammer does take 6 fully charged hits to the front of a giant to kill, but as long as you hit a limb that isn't broken off yet, you are guaranteed to break that limb. And if you break the limb of a giant, it is a guaranteed stagger. So all you have to do is just charge up a melee, run up to it and hit it before you get all the way into its melee range, break that limb, fall back while it's staggered, charge up a new hit, and then rinse and repeat until it's dead. It takes a bit more skill and it is a bit risky since you do have to get almost within its punching range in order to actually hit a limb, and if you mistime your swing even just a little bit, you are going to get smacked back. But with a bit of practice and testing it out a bit, you should be able to manage it and eventually get to the point where you can solo kill giants without having to worry about it hitting you back very often. And then finally, when it comes to the scouts, as you can already guess, the Sledgehammer is fairly effective at dealing with them. 1 fully charged hit to the head, whether it be the front or the back, will finish off a scout. So I just let it come up to you and bonk it as it gets close, or if you want to be a bit more aggressive, charge up your melee, run towards it before you fully finish the charge, and then as you get close to it, jump, smack in the head with a full hit, and it will die. Now, looking over everything we just talked about, the Sledgehammer seems like a really good melee option. The stats are pretty much good all across the board, it's really effective at dealing with almost every single type of enemy in the game. So what's the drawback? What's the flaw of the Sledgehammer? Because right now, it seems like the Sledgehammer is just the best one in the game. It's good at pretty much everything there is, and there's not really a moment where it falls off and doesn't work that effective. So how is it that the other melee weapons can even possibly compare with the Sledgehammer? Well, simply put, while the Sledgehammer is good at just about everything there is in the game, it's not great at anything in particular. Think of it like this. The Sledgehammer is the jack of all trades that doesn't excel at anything. And that to me is the biggest flaw or drawback of the Sledgehammer. The fact that if I take it, yes, I'll be able to handle pretty much any challenge I have to face in that level, but there might be a melee weapon that's even better or suits my playstyle even more that actually gives me that satisfaction of knowing, hey, it's my time to shine. This is where my melee weapon excels. You don't really get that feeling with the Sledgehammer. But if you're somebody who doesn't really care about getting that feeling and you just want to be good at pretty much everything no matter what, then hey, Sledgehammer is a very solid choice. Next up we have the Spear, which is a weapon that is often compared to that of the Sledgehammer due to the fact that they have very similar stats. These stats being 2 damage on the basic attack, 17.5 damage on a fully charged attack. It takes about 1.7 seconds to charge it up all the way. It has a high stamina consumption, the exact same as the Sledgehammer as a matter of fact. It has a 1 times precision multiplier on basic hits, but a 1.3 precision multiplier on charge attacks. It has a 2 times stagger multiplier on the basic hit, a 1 times stagger multiplier on charged attacks, and finally it has a 1 times environmental damage on both basic and charged attacks. So right off the bat, we can see that the spear has a little bit less base damage, but it actually can hit even harder than the sledgehammer due to the fact that it has a 1.3 precision multiplier on the charged hit. Doing a fully charged hit on the head of an enemy is going to do more damage with the spear than it would with the sledgehammer. Although the damage difference isn't really a whole lot different. It's only an extra 2.5 or something like that, I believe. Which in a way basically just balances out the loss of base damage you have with the spear. As long as you are mostly landing headshots with the spear, you're pretty much doing the exact same amount of damage as you would with the sledgehammer. So if anything, I would just simply say that their damages are practically the same. The other stats are a little bit lower in some areas, and it still does have a high stamina consumption and long charge up time, but there are still a few other things going for the spear that you don't necessarily see from the stats alone. The first one being a bit of a killer that I know causes a lot of people to shy away from the spear, which is the fact that you cannot sprint and charge the spear at the same time. I know this is a big downside to a lot of people since people love the freedom of movement and being able to run around a lot and bonk enemies in a bit more of a tight situation, and unfortunately that is something you just cannot do with the spear. But don't let that alone shy you away from it because it does have a few other things going for it. The first one being that it has the longest range of all melees and by a pretty considerable amount. While it might not be useful in almost every single situation, it is quite helpful in situations where you're fighting enemies that have a physical punching attack like chargers or giants. We'll talk more about it later when we actually compare to all the enemies, but you are going to be able to poke them from a safe distance without letting them smack you back in retaliation. And then the other thing going for it is the fact that the spear can pierce through enemies, although this is a little bit situational. This used to be a lot more powerful when Rundown 6 first came out, but it was way too overpowered so it got nerfed a bit. But even then, you can still get multi-hits with the spear, which can help out a lot in those situations where you have a lot of enemies right next to each other, or you have multiple enemies who are rushing you down at the same time. So definitely take this in consideration when looking at the spear. And now that we've looked through the stats of the spear, let's actually talk about the enemies themselves and how it fares against each type of them. When it comes to dealing with strikers and shooters, the spear is effective, but it does require a bit more precision. Since this is a precision-based weapon, you are going to want to make sure you aim for the head, that way you can maximize your damage and actually kill them in one go. And because you don't really have enough base damage to actually be able to just one-tap strikers or shooters to the back of the head and actually deal a fair amount of damage, you do need to be a bit more cautious when there are multiple of them really close to each other. Overall, the spear definitely isn't bad at dealing with multiple enemies in close proximity, but it's not nearly as good as some of the other melee weapons. When it comes to chargers, you are able to one-shot them to the back with a fully charged hit, or if you cannot get behind them, 2 fully charged shots to the front will finish them off. The extra range is actually quite helpful as well, since you don't have to worry about getting close enough to them where they can punch you back. So if you're somebody who's getting a little bit tired of trying to double tap chargers getting slapped back because of them, well, maybe the spear might be good for you. When it comes to giants though, this is where I would say the spear truly excels. This thing is amazing at dealing with giants since you are able to poke them from a safe enough distance that you don't even have to worry about getting slapped for 40% damage. The only thing you really need to worry about would actually be the tongue attack, which does a fair amount less. And even then, you can completely avoid this. One fully charged hit from the spear will break a limb just like the sledgehammer does. So all you have to do is make sure you aim for the head, the arms, the legs, and the torso, and just keep on poking until it's dead. It will take a few more hits. I think it takes about 7 fully charged hits from the spear to kill a giant, but you can do it from a fairly safe distance. Heck, I've actually seen people who are really skilled with the spear who take on 2 giants at the same time by just poking one at a time and taking advantage of a little bit of cover. So if you're somebody who loves being able to just melee kill giants and you're tired of risking 40% HP every time you go in to smack it, then the spear could be an excellent choice for you. And then finally, when it comes to dealing with scouts, the spear is also pretty effective. One fully charged hit to the front or back of the head will finish off a scout, and while you might not be able to run up to it to poke it, you can just simply walk up to it and poke it due to the long extra range you have. Obviously, be careful of the tentacles, as soon as you touch one, you're sort of on a short little window of time before it becomes invincible, but it is still completely possible to do with a little bit of patience. So overall, looking at the stats and how effective it is at certain type of enemies, I would say that while the spear is not nearly as effective at dealing with smaller enemies like some of the other melee weapons are, it is very good at dealing with pretty much everything else. The ability to stay out of punching range of chargers, giant strikers, and hybrids and so forth, and still be able to deal a pretty solid amount of damage back to them is incredibly helpful. And that precision damage will help out a little bit in making up for a lack of damage you might have if somebody takes a bat or a knife. While it doesn't perfectly make up for it, it can help out just a little bit against some of the more powerful enemies that have a whole lot more HP. So if you're somebody who wants to be able to deal with these enemies from a safer distance and you don't mind the fact that you can no longer sprint and charge a melee at the same time, then I would definitely recommend giving the spear a go. You might fall in love with this thing a lot faster than you expect to. Next on the list we have the bat, which is a melee weapon that I didn't really know what its purpose was for quite a while. It wasn't until some friends pointed it out to me and I actually did some testing with it that I saw how powerful the bat can be in the right hands. Instead of just simply telling you what it is right off the bat though, let's look at the statistics and see if you can figure out its strong point. The bat does 3 damage with a basic attack, 12 damage with a fully charged hit. It takes about 1 second to charge it up all the way. Its stamina consumption is on the low side of things. It has a 1.0 precision multiplier on both basic attacks and charge attacks. It has a 5.0 stagger multiplier on both basic and charged attacks. And finally, it has a 5.0 multiplier for environmental damage on both basic and charged attacks. So, can you see where the strong point of the bat is? In case you're a little bit uncertain, it would be the stagger multiplier it has. 5.0 on stagger for both basic and charged attacks is absolutely ridiculous. What this weapon lacks in just raw damage, it more than makes up for in its low stamina consumption, its very fast charge up time, and its ridiculous stagger capabilities. We'll talk more specifically about each type of enemy a little bit later, but just to let you know, the bat can stagger just about any type of enemy in this game with relative ease. Some a bit more dangerous than others, but it can still do it, and that is absolutely amazing to me. This thing is the ultimate support weapon. In a way, its left click is just like a right click, because a right click is a guaranteed stagger on weaker enemies. However, it's even better than a right click, because shoving in this game consumes stamina, but doing just simple hits with any melee weapon doesn't. So the bat's basic left click is basically a right click that doesn't consume stamina and actually does damage. This can make it very powerful if you know how to abuse it. You will quite literally just stagger chain pretty much any enemy you come up across, or even multiple enemies if you get really good at it. And as a little extra bonus, it is capable of one-tapping locks with a basic hit. So if you're ever in a level where speed is key and you're being rushed through it and you need to go through either a lot of boxes of lockers that have padlocks on them or break open a lot of padlocks on doors, the bat, you could just keep on running, give it a quick little smack so you don't have to worry about losing any stamina from it, and just keep on moving. So the bat can be very helpful if you're somebody who likes to run around a lot and just stagger chain enemies and keep on moving. When it comes to dealing with strikers and shooters, the bat is very effective. Due to the fact that it has the same base damage of that of the Sledgehammer, you are also able to one-tap shooters to the back of the head with a simple hit with the bat, or if you're fighting strikers, you could just one-tap them in the back of the head and then one-tap them anywhere on the body to finish them off. Or if you're unable to get behind them and go for the occiput, one fully charged hit anywhere on the head will kill them. Combine this with the fact that it only takes about 1 second to fully charge up the bat, and you can very easily kill chain multiple strikers and shooters in close proximity. And even if you make a mistake and multiple of them are awake and coming after you at the same time, you could just simply go for left clicks and just stagger chain every single one of them. One light swing from the bat is enough to guarantee stagger a striker or shooter, so as long as you just keep alternating between which one you hit and you hit the one that's right about to attack you first, you could just keep on going back and forth between all of them, and as long as there aren't more than like 4, 5, 6, or 7, you can actually just keep stagger chain all of them and make it so they cannot hit you. And this can be very helpful in certain situations. So the bat is very good at dealing with smaller enemies. When it comes to dealing with chargers, you're unable to one-tap them no matter what you do, but one fully charged hit to their spinal column and then one fully charged hit to anywhere else on the body will finish them off. That, or if you can't get behind them, 3 fully charged hits to the front will kill them. The really nice thing about the bat and chargers though, is the fact that just like strikers and shooters, a simple hit that is completely uncharged has enough power to guarantee stagger a charger no matter where you hit it. So if you're in a situation where you kill one charger and another one wakes up, all you have to do is quickly walk over to it, bap it once with the bat to stagger it, and then back up a little bit, keep on charging up your bat, and then once you see the charger coming out of that staggering animation, hit it again to reapply the stagger. You aren't able to stand right on top of one and just spam click since there is a tiny window in between staggers where they can punch you back, but if you keep your distance and you pay attention to the animation, you are able to just perma-stagger a charger as well. If you get really good at it, you might even be able to stagger chain multiple of them. Although I would recommend you be a little bit careful with this because if you bite off more than you could chew, you're definitely going to take a lot of damage. Then when it comes to giant enemies, this is where I thought the bat was really going to fall off, but to my surprise, it doesn't completely fall off. While it has low base damage and takes 10 fully charged hits to the front of a giant in order to actually kill one fully charged hit from the bat is a guaranteed stagger on even a giant. You don't even have to aim for the limbs. You could just keep hitting it in the stomach over and over again, and it's a guaranteed stagger. You can 1v1 a giant with a bat, but you need to be very careful with it and you have to be skilled, because you have to get very close to a giant in order to hit with a bat due to its short range. So you have to get close enough to it that it can punch you back. So if you mistime your swing, you are going to get smacked for 40% damage. So while it is possible to go mano a mano against a giant with a bat, you do need to be skilled and you need to know the timing, otherwise you are going to get hit quite a bit. And then finally, when it comes to the scouts, the bat, while not the most effective weapon, is still capable of dealing with them. One fully charged hit to the occiput or back of the head of a scout will bring it down to the ground dead. But you need to make sure you hit it there. You cannot take advantage of the stagger with the bat, because if you do stagger a scout, that tiny window in between each staggers is enough for it to become immune, scream, and spawn in a wave of enemies. So if you want to deal with the scout with the bat, you have to make sure you do a fully charged hit to the back of the head, otherwise it is going to alert. So looking at the stats and the enemies, we can see that while the bat is lacking a little bit in raw damage, it is by no means weak against pretty much any type of enemy. It is very powerful against smaller enemies, pretty good against medium tier ones. It works alright against large and specials as long as you know what you're doing, and it's just a stagger machine. If you are somebody who is willing to sacrifice some raw damage for more utility and strength in other locations, the bat can be a wonderful option for you. And finally, we have the knife, the melee weapon that I by far use the most out of any of the other ones, and is definitely my favorite one to bring with me down into the complex. But of course, my biased opinions have no place in this video, so let's stick to the actual factual information and start off with the statistics. The knife does 2 damage with its basic attacks, 5.5 damage with fully charged hits. It takes about 0.5 seconds to fully charge up the knife. It consumes no stamina whatsoever. It has a 1.0 precision multiplier on basic attacks, but a 1.5 precision multiplier on fully charged attacks. It has a 1.0 stagger multiplier on both basic and charged hits. And finally, it has a 0.8 environmental multiplier on basic attacks and a 1.5 environmental multiplier on fully charged attacks. Now, right off the bat, we can see that the knife's base damage is quite a bit lower than any of the other melee weapons. But just like the bat, it makes up for it in its very fast charge time, its lack of stamina consumption, and its precision damage multiplier. The knife is a precision-based weapon, sort of like the spear, where you want to aim for enemies in the head and not necessarily the body. That way you can maximize damage. But even then, there are 2 other things going for the knife that you wouldn't know just by looking at the stats. The first one being that you have a 2 times damage multiplier on sleeping enemies with your fully charged attacks. This is pretty nice, as it doesn't really make a big play against smaller, weaker enemies, but against some of the little bit more powerful enemies, that 2 times damage multiplier actually helps out a lot. We'll definitely be talking about that a little bit later in this portion. And the other feature is that it is a low noise weapon, which supposedly reduces aggro detection when hitting locks and killing sleepers. Now, as somebody who uses the knife a lot, I have to be honest, this is a feature that I don't really notice. I don't know if it's just because I'm not paying attention to it or because I don't use the other melee weapons enough, but apparently what it's supposed to do is when you kill a sleeper, there's a much lower chance that a sleeper across the room is going to just randomly wake up because you killed that enemy. That, and when you are smashing those padlocks, enemies could be a little bit closer to you before they actually wake up, unlike the other melee weapons. Again though, this is something that I have personally never really noticed myself as I use the knife, but it is a feature, so it's only right for me to mention it. And now that you have a good idea of the statistics of the knife, let's talk about how it actually applies to each type of enemy. When it comes to dealing with regular strikers and shooters, the knife is absolutely insane, assuming you have precise aim. The thing is, you have to do a fully charged hit to the head of a striker or shooter in order to finish it off. If you hit the body, you're just not really going to be doing enough to actually kill it. But even then, with its very fast charge up time, if you do miss and accidentally hit a striker in the shoulder, you have enough time to prep another hit and stab it in the head before it has the time to react and actually hit you back. So as long as you're precise, you can mow through even large groups of regular strikers and shooters with ease with the knife. I kid you not, you are going to cut through them like butter if you know what you're doing. And the other thing too is if you wake up a very large group of enemies, you can just simply run circles around them to dodge their attacks and just keep on stabbing them over and over with the knife because there is no stamina consumption. You can run circles around them for a pretty decent amount of time before your pulse starts getting too high to the point where you start slowing down. So if you love running around and stabbing enemies, the knife is a very good option for you. It's absolutely insane at how effective this thing is at dealing with smaller enemies when you have the skills to back it up. When it comes to dealing with chargers, the knife can do it, but it's a little bit more situational. A fully charged hit to the back of a charger will only do 1/3 of its HP unless if it's asleep. Because if it's asleep, you get that 2x damage multiplier and you end up doing 2/3 of its HP. Then all you need to do is make sure while it's being staggered, you need to do another fully charged hit to the back of it and that will finish it off. Of course though, this is situational because if other enemies are nearby, you might not be able to pull this off without waking them up. And the other thing too is that there's always that chance that when you first stab that charger, it might do a 180 on you while it's staggering, and then when you go for the second stab, you're going to hit the stomach, and that's not going to kill it. You'll then have to prep a third stab, and in that time, that charger can very easily smack you back once or twice. So it is possible to kill chargers, but I recommend you only do it when it's not a huge deal if the room wakes up, when the charger is isolated, and you're perfectly fine with the fact that you might end up taking 4 or 8% damage to tank. That way you can actually kill it in case it does do a 180 on you. Then when it comes to giants, I'm going to be blunt, you just simply don't. The knife just cannot deal with giants whatsoever. You do very low damage against them. You don't have enough damage to even break off a limb in one strike, so you can't just simply stagger chain it like you can the other melee weapons. And because it has such short range, if you get close enough to stab a giant, you're close enough for it to smack you back. The only way to actually kill a giant with a knife, mano-a-mano style, is if you bait out a swing of a giant and then hit it while it's finishing the swinging animation. And even then, the amount of stabs that you would need to do to actually kill it, it just hurts my brain. So take it from a person who uses the knife a lot. Don't bother trying to kill a giant with a knife. Let your other team members do it instead. It's much more effective for them. And then finally, when it comes to dealing with scouts, the knife is pretty effective, but it's just like the bat. You need to do a fully charged hit to the back of the head of a scout in order to kill it. You do not get that 2x damage multiplier since the scout is technically not asleep. So it has to be back of the head. If you hit it anywhere else, it will not kill it. You also won't even stagger it, so it's just immediately going to go immune and just scream and wake up the entire room and spawn in a wave of enemies. So make sure you aim for the back of the head. I also recommend that you jump right before you stab, since the knife sort of comes from torso height when you stab. It's not an overhead swing like some of the other melee weapons. So if you really want to make sure that you're actually going to hit the head of the scout, jump as you're swinging, and that way you have a higher chance of hitting it and a lower chance of hitting the shoulders. Overall, when it comes to dealing with type of enemies, I would say that the knife is absolutely insane at dealing with smaller enemies. It's fairly decent at medium type enemies, although it's a bit situational. Giants, just don't even bother, and scouts, feel free to. As long as you're going up from behind and assassinating it properly, you should have no problem. Overall, the knife is a very powerful melee weapon against smaller enemies, and if you're willing to sacrifice the kill potential on bigger, more powerful ones, then by all means, take it. It's a lot of fun, and I seriously cannot stress enough just how quickly you will plow through smaller enemies with the knife once you get good with it. Alright, so that was a lot of information that we just went over, so how about we do a very quick recap and summary of each of the melee weapons and what their pros and cons are. Starting off with the Sledgehammer. If you're looking for a weapon that is good at pretty much everything, a jack of all trades that doesn't excel in anything in particular, the Sledgehammer is a good choice for you. This thing is amazing to take for pretty much every type of situation, as there's never really a situation where it falls off like some of the other melee weapons can. Or if you're just going into a level that you haven't done before and you don't know what type of enemies to expect, the Sledgehammer could be a really good addition for you and your team. The spear is great for dealing with giant enemies or enemies that have physical punching attacks due to its long range and its precision damage multiplier. If you're somebody who wants to be able to melee those type of enemies but you don't want to risk getting smacked back for it, spear can help out quite a bit. It's also quite nice because it can potentially make up for the loss of damage that you have on your team due to people taking bats or knives. That way your stealth kill against giant enemies goes a little bit smoother. The biggest drawback to the spear is just being the fact that you can't sprint while charging it, but if that doesn't phase you, then there's really no downside to the spear. The bat is an absolutely amazing support weapon due to its high stagger multiplier and quick charge up time. If you're fine with losing some of that raw damage in exchange for utility and freedom of movement due to the low stamina consumption, then the bat might be the weapon for you. You never know when stagger chaining an enemy or two might save your run. And finally, when it comes to the knife, this is an absolutely amazing weapon at dealing with weaker enemies even when they're in large groups. With a bit of practice and game knowledge, you can very effectively just stealth kill rooms with a lot of enemies in it. It's also a lot of fun to use it if you're someone who enjoys running around a lot and killing off enemies left and right without having to worry about your stamina running low. So if that sounds like you, knife could be a good choice for you. And really, its only drawback is the fact that the knife just can't really kill anything that's bigger. You know, giants are just an absolute no-go to it, but if you're fine with either just relying on your guns to kill giants or relying on your team members, then you can definitely work around this. I just would recommend don't take the knife into a level where 90% of the enemies are going to be giants, because then you're going to be useless most of the time. And with all of that, I have gone over everything that I wanted to talk about when it comes to GTFO's 4 brand new melee weapons that were introduced with Rundown 6. Another general guide and informative video comes to an end. What did you all think about this one? Did you learn some new things about the melee weapons? Have your eyes been open to the hidden secrets laid dormant beneath a pile of code? Or did you come out of this experience feeling like your time was wasted and you learned nothing new and valuable from it? Well, whatever your thoughts are, as always, let me know down in the comments. Once again, my apologies for how long it took for me to get around to making this video. I know that there's been a lot of discussion on these 4 new melee weapons ever since R6's release, some being receptive while others being a bit more rigid, and I wanted to share my own thoughts on them. While I may be a hardcore knife lover who doesn't often take anything else, I do acknowledge that all 4 weapons have a proper place in this game. Maybe they're not perfect where they stand at now, and they might even receive minor changes in the future, but that doesn't mean any of them are next to useless compared to the others. Ultimately though, that final decision is a personal preference and comes down to you, the player. As always though, if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, then consider hitting that like button. It helps out the channel and it helps these videos get noticed by people who might be interested in them. And while you're down there, you might as well hit that subscribe button and ring that bell to get notified whenever I post a new video. I also have my own Discord server, so if you want to go the extra mile and become part of the community I'm building, hop right on in. Link is down in the description. Also in the description, you can find a link that will take you to the official GTFO merch store. So if you love this game and want to pick up some sweet merch, go take a look and see what they've got for you. By no means whatsoever am I sponsored by 10 Chambers, so I'm not being paid to tell you that. I just love their merch and think it's a good way to get yourself something nice and support the devs of this awesome game in the process. Until next time, don't forget to think back to what you learned in this video the next time you're about to drop down into the complex. There are always options for you out there, so don't limit yourself. And I'll see you all in the next video.